Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining. Thank you for joining the webinar. My name is Aisha, and I'm one of the coordinators of the IE Compliance Club. First of all, I hope everyone's doing well. I hope everyone's safe and at home. And I also want to thank Net Impact Club. Thank you, Fabia. And thank you to the Finance and Capital Markets Club as well for collaborating and promoting this event for us. Now I'd like you to meet Jaime Silos. He'll be our amazing guest for the day. He's also been my professor and taught me social corporate responsibility during my master's, which I'm doing right now at IE in law school. Jaime is the corporate development director of Forética, which is a business network focusing on sustainability, corporate social responsibility in Spain and Latin America. They work towards integrating environmental, social, and governance's impacts on the financial performances of world-renowned companies and investors. Jaime has strong background in finance, strategy, and sustainability, and today he's going to be talking about financial, sustainable, and regulatory dimensions of the COVID, and also be discussing some key lessons from an extra financial systemic shock. I do want to point out that if you have any questions, we're going to take that at the end of the webinar, but if you both forget by then, make sure to write it in the comments, and then we can have Jaime answer that in the end. Or if you want, of course, like save your questions, and then you can just switch on your mic and answer them in the end. So just wait for the Q&A session as well. Thank you, Jaime, for being here. You can start now.
All right, thank you very much for this warm welcome. Thank you all for joining us in this conversation about, guess what, the COVID-19 crisis and the implications of this crisis in terms of sustainability and finance. So actually, I'm going to be focusing on what's going to happen afterwards with sustainability agendas, with governance agendas, and of course, from the perspective of investing. So I want to thank again the different clubs, the Compliance Club, the Net Impact Club, and the Finance and Capital Markets for giving me the opportunity. I myself am a proud alumni of the IE, and of course I'm also a professor, so I'm happy to collaborate in any way I can to spread knowledge and ideas in this particular case about the COVID-19 crisis. So today we have a very diverse audience, which means that you might find at some points that my presentation might be a little bit broad and sometimes too specific, but I want to balance and I want to make sure that all of you have get the right food for thought so that we can be sharing ideas. And at the end, of course, if there's something that you want to bring up or you want to ask, of course, as like Aisha said, you can go ahead. Just a quick word about what we're doing at Forética, because we're in the middle of the crisis about this COVID-19. We've been connecting for quite some time the world of health with the world of sustainability, which means that this COVID-19 crisis doesn't come necessarily as a surprise. It comes as a shock indeed, but not necessarily as a surprise for the reasons I'll give you a little bit later on. So like I said, we've been connecting these two worlds of health and sustainability. And I'm very happy to share with you that today we're launching a new platform that is going to talk about the future of sustainability in this post-COVID-19 era, because we believe that sustainability agenda is going to change and it's going to have to adapt to this new reality. Okay, having said that, let's cut to the chase, and I would like to begin by asking you a question, right? So we have this COVID-19 crisis already there. The markets are reacting with tremendous volatility. They were saved by central banks. And my question to you guys is, do you think that in the aftermath of this COVID-19 crisis, markets, are they going to demand more sustainability or less sustainability from companies? So in order for you to respond to this question, just hit your browsers and go to www.menti.com and insert the code. I'll read it out loud for you. It's a 2729, so 27209. And please answer the question. So we have a few responses ready. Okay, everybody thinks it will increase. Okay, total consensus. Does anybody who disagrees, please, just to give a little bit more flavor to this? Okay, so let's stop it there. I don't want you to stay all day answering, but the thing is that we see a clear consensus, which was easy because if you join this webinar, it's because you believe that ESG is important somehow. So we're gonna see whether this is true in the end or not. So the three basic questions I want to address today are the following. The first thing I'm going to cover is what's the connection, if any, between sustainability and the COVID-19? The second question is, okay, the market reacted, but did it react with an ESG lens, or was it just an indiscriminate selling when it was coming down, right? And the last question is, okay, what's going to be next? How is the COVID-19 going to shape up a business strategy and the future of sustainability and the future of investing? Okay, so let's start by defining this crisis, and we'll establish some. So this crisis is what we would call an ESG shock. What is an ESG shock? Of course, it's a shock that involves the environmental dimension, the social dimension, and of course, the governance dimension. So we're pretty used to shocks when they happen with a company or a couple of companies. For example, the Facebook fiasco with Cambridge Analytica, or the Dieselgate with VW, or the Wells Fargo case. Those are cases that I work a lot with my students. But shock is different. And the reason why this is different is because it's systemic and therefore is non-diversifiable. So what do I mean by this? Well, I mean that you're going to be exposed. It doesn't matter whether you are rich or poor, you live north or south, whether you are a business person or a blue-collar worker, you're going to be affected somehow. Consequences might be different, but we are all in the same boat here, and we're going to be all affected. So we've always thought that the next systemic crisis would be a climate change related systemic crisis. But guess what? The COVID-19 got in the way, and it provides us with a great opportunity to learn what happens when the music stops, right? When you have a systemic crisis with no precedent. So it's like a training for future systemic climate related crisis, right? And the thing about this crisis is that it showcases lots of structural vulnerabilities in our social and economic systems. So I'm just going to quickly walk you through some of the main vulnerabilities that I found. Of course, there are many more, but we don't have the time. So I'm just going to summarize some of them. So I'm going to classify these vulnerabilities into two groups. On the one hand, I'm going to talk about vulnerabilities that have to do with the way we live. And on the other hand, I'm going to talk about those vulnerabilities that have to do with the way we produce, the way we operate economically. So let's talk about the way we live. So if we go to the very root of this crisis, the beginning of the crisis is a virus, right? So it's a virus that lived among animals and then it jumped into human bodies, right? So scientists for many decades now have been warning us have been warning humanity that, hey guys, you're overreaching, you're invading ever more so nature space, you're expanding your cities, you're expanding your operations, your factories, and you're getting closer to other species that are rarer compared to the kind of animals that we engage with, like geese and cows. And then eventually, some of these animals would bring new pandemics because our immune systems are not used to this kind of shocks or these kind of viruses, and this could be a potential challenge. Well, guess what? We have the COVID-19, and there you go. So for some of you, you might think that it's a very loose connection, but let me say this. Scientists have also been warning us that climate change is going to bring not only huge storms and droughts and hurricanes and things like that, it's also going to bring us new diseases, new pandemics, right? So warmer temperatures and changing in moist conditions is going to make other diseases emerge. In this case, we have a new disease, the COVID-19. In other cases, it's going to be all diseases that were already eradicated and then pop, they reemerge. Be just heat waves, right, affecting our organs. So climate change is going to be pretty much related to health crisis. That's why we have this connection between sustainability and health. A second vulnerability related to the way we live is that we are mobile citizens of the world, right? So we tend to move a lot, and we are IE people. You guys are IE people, so you have very interesting careers. So you travel a lot, either it's for work or for pleasure, and this kind of pattern accelerates the expansion of a virus, right? I'm not blaming you or me or myself for this kind of situation, but it's another vulnerability that we travel a lot, we move a lot, we are ever more connected than ever, and that this can create new challenges. And the third vulnerability related to the way we live have to do with inequalities. Income inequality and also the lack of safety nets for great proportions of our societies are also an accelerator of the pandemic and of the crisis. So today, government officials tell us, stay home, don't go out unless it's absolutely necessary. And if you're sick, you can go to the doctor.
Pues
but
muy
this
bien.
is,
¿Tú?
I'm sorry? Please, if you could mute your mics, please. Okay, so I'll continue. So I was just referring to these situations in which we take for granted that we have some degree of safety nets, but this is not the case for several hundreds of millions and even billions of people in this planet who cannot afford to stay home. For many people, too many people, staying home is not an option. And when staying home is not an option, because you have to bring food to the table, then you are forced, you're compelled to go to work even if you don't feel okay. And of course, that also spreads the virus. Now, this crisis is also make inequality a bigger problem because the resilience of different economies and different economic profiles differ, right? So, for example, I'm based here in Spain, so you have a tension between people who have children who are not attending school right now. If you don't have like 15 connected screens in your home, there's no way for them to follow school. So this is going to create a bigger problem down the road because kids' education is at risk right now. And this is one of the examples related to income inequalities in this COVID-19 crisis. Took for granted at business schools to be questioned and challenged. For instance, globalization itself, right? So for the last 30 to 40 years, we've been building complex global and interdependent supply chains. And this creates a great opportunity from an economic standpoint. It creates lots of efficiencies in the marketplace, but at the same time, it creates one very important vulnerability, which is a greater correlation within the global economy. So when you have a problem in one country, it's ever more likely that you're going to have problem in several countries, if not in the global economy. So this started as a domestic problem, so to speak, in China. Then suddenly it moved to Singapore, Hong Kong, South Korea, Japan, then Italy, Spain, Europe, US, and the whole wide world, right? So this vulnerability is built in, and we see that this recession is not being offset by another country doing better and then pulling us out of the crisis. So that's, again, a very important weakness that we have. Now, this problem is being compounded by the fact that in the aftermath of the financial crisis, we have shifted towards a political point of view that is mercantilist and protectionist. So, for example, take the America First policy is not gonna help us much if we try to coordinate a global response to this crisis. So different countries have grown apart from each other, and today it's even more difficult to get this kind of response. And I don't want to talk only about the US. Take, for example, India, right? We have Mr. Modi here. I don't know if everybody is aware that India is one of the largest suppliers of generic drugs. So India, as any other country, is also concerned about their domestic response to the crisis. So they want to make sure that they have enough medicines to face this crisis. So they're starting to put limits to exports of medicine. And this creates, again, a big risk for the global healthcare systems around the world. The other, so when this happens, of course, you lack of the basic needs, and I'm talking from Spain, we don't have enough gloves and masks, and this is a huge problem. If we want to lift the restrictions, we have to make sure that we have enough material. And this scarce resource is being competed away in the marketplace. Now, the other paradigm that is going to be shifting is the idea of super efficient supply chains, right? This idea that back in the days when I was doing my MBAs, this just-in-time, those lean manufacturing systems were the hottest thing, right? So producing with no stocks, producing in a way that is all demand driven, so you wouldn't have any stocks because the whole supply chain is integrated. Well, so this is, again, very efficient, but guess what? When the music stops, it really does stop, right? So we have empty factories that cannot open, not just because there's a virus, but because there's a lack of supplies. So I think in the next decade, we're gonna be in this conflict between, this trade-off between economic efficiency against safety and resilience. So I think many things are gonna change. I believe that we're going to into a less global world, and this is gonna affect, of course, the operating costs of many companies. Okay, so enough about vulnerabilities. Now we're gonna talk about what has been the market reaction to these COVID-19 crisis. So what was the market reaction? And let's see if from an ESG standpoint, we can see a difference in the way that the markets responded to these crises. Before I do that, I want to focus a little bit in the theory of it. This is something that I work a lot with my students. It's how can we create financial value through sustainability practices, right? So how can we do that? Well, the same way that we can create value with any other business activity. There are only two ways that we can create financial value. We can either increase our return on capital. That would be to increase the earnings and the cash flows for a given amount of capital employed. Or if we go below, we can lower our cost of capital. And when we lower our cost of capital, our company's valuations can be lifted, right? So these are the two ways with which we can create value. So let's go to the top. So how can we create financial value through sustainability? Well, for one, we can grow faster, right? If we try to address the big challenges that sustainability poses, then we're going to be able to exploit new growth platforms, climate related or otherwise, or circular economy related. So there are many growth opportunities that have to do with tackling sustainability challenges. Another way to do this is through our brand value, right? If we are a brand that is aligned with society's expectations and needs, then we're going to become what a marketer would call a meaningful brand, right? A brand that tells something to their consumers, right? So this is the case for many consumer companies that are integrating sustainability within their brand attributes. The third element has to do with resource productivity, right? The fact that we can produce more with less. If we produce more with less resources, then we're going to be not only sustainable, but we also going to improve. We're going to increase our margins, right? And finally, we have the notion of a better human capital. So if we're the same thing that we apply to society also applies to our human capital. If my employees share my purpose as a business, if they think that it's worth it, that it's meaningful, that we're doing something other than, or on top of making money, but we're delivering some value to society, then we're going to have better access to talent, better access to better human capital, right? So that would be the narrative part, so to speak. But if we go to the lower part, to the cost of capital, that's where we find the right connection, the most immediate connection for this COVID crisis, right? Through cost of capital. Why would sustainable companies enjoy a lower cost of capital? Well, it's because they're less risky, right? So they're less prone to experience an ESG shock, like the Cambridge Analytica scandal, for example. They're less scrutinized by governments because they're good citizens, so to speak, so they don't attract this regulation on them. I mean, there are many, many, many reasons why a sustainable company could or should enjoy a lower cost of capital. So the way to express that cost of capital is through risk premiums, right? So investors would demand a lower premium to a sustainable company, or through a better access to capital. Okay, so much for the theory. Let's see if this holds up in reality. So what I'm bringing you here is a chart that is not contaminated by the COVID crisis. So what you're seeing here is the close of two indices on May the 31st, 2019. So almost 1 year ago, long before the crisis, long before the COVID-19. So you have two lines here. You have a yellow line that would be your MSCI All Country World Index. So that's the MSCI ACWI that would integrate stocks from all over the planet. So it's the most preferred global equity index. And then you have the blue line, which is the MSCI's All Country World Index ESG leaders. It's the same idea, but it only includes the top performers when it comes to sustainability, when it comes to ESG. So to give you some order of magnitude, in the MSCI regular ACWI, you would have about a little bit over 3,000 companies. In the MSCI ACWI ESG leaders, you would have a little bit more than 1,200 companies. So still, it's a very significant sample of very sustainable companies that are global, right? So how did these indices perform? Well, if we look at returns, you're going to find that almost in every time period, the MSCI, the ESG version of the global index, outperform the overall market. The only exception is when you analyze a 3-year period, but it's fair to say that this difference has been corrected. So if you did this calculation now, you would find that in every single time period that you're analyzing, ESG stocks outperformed regular stocks. But of course, those of you that come from the capital markets are going to ask me, well, yeah, but what matters is not only return, what really matters is risk-adjusted returns, right? So let's take a look into the risk characteristics of this in this index, right? So here again, you cannot find a single time period in which sustainable equities were riskier than non-sustainable equities. So systematically, you find lower risk, both in relative terms, like in the beta, or also in absolute terms with the standard deviation. So when you combine a higher return and at the same time a lower risk, then what it does, it boosts the Sharpe ratios of this index, right? So that ultimately would justify a premium. And when you look into the fundamentals, you will see, for example, using the price earnings ratio, you're gonna find that typically the ESG premium in global equities is about 9%. That means that investors are willing to pay 9% more for the same dollar of earnings in a sustainable company than from the same dollar of earnings in a non-sustainable company. And there are also regional biases. For instance, the ESG equity premium in Europe for European equities is about 12%. And even if you go to emerging markets, the premium is about 30%. So there's clearly an ESG premium. So ESG is adding quality to investments. And now let's go back again to the COVID-19 crisis, because this crisis also gives us a new opportunity to test this kind of assumptions, like that sustainable companies fare better in this kind of crisis. So I'm going to give you 2 examples as to how sustainable companies adapted better to this crisis. The first one relates to health, right? Those companies that have been promoting health and well-being in their workplaces were faster in order to assess the severity of this crisis, and they took quicker decisions, making safer decisions, both for the employees and also for the customers. Likewise, those companies that have better human capital policies that create a bigger degree of empowerment to the employees, a bigger degree of autonomy and flexibility, these type of companies were able to shift from a get-together workplace, a face-to-face workplace, to a digital remote workplace with almost no friction, with almost no discontinuity in their services. So these are very good examples of how companies can actually adapt in this type of crisis. Now the question is, okay, that sounds fair enough, but did the market notice that these companies are doing better? Yes. Actually, what you see here in this graph, this would be the year-to-date returns of 2 regional indices. One would be global equities with your MSCI ACWI, and the other one would be MSCI Europe for European equities. And what you see in this chart is a relative performance, which means that's a ratio between the ESG index divided by the non-ESG index. So if you have something over 100, it means that ESG stocks outperform the overall market. And that's what you're seeing. So since the beginning of the crisis, ESG related stocks, sustainable stocks, have been outperforming the market in a big way, which means that that old trend that we already saw 2 slides ago is accelerating. So this crisis is boosting the return for the returns of sustainable equities, even though the market is of course a little bit depressed, of course. And this pattern doesn't only show in equities, you can also see it in bonds. Here you can see the performance of green bonds versus regular bonds. That would be US high-grade corporate bonds. And as you can see, in the moments of greater stress, you see a greater performance and a spread of over 500 basis points. Okay, that would be a plus 5% return for green bonds versus non-green bonds. So if you're thinking about, okay, I want to play the market right now, I want to do it in a sustainable way, and I want to hedge my COVID-19 exposure, sustainable instruments are going to help you. So you could do it by buying green bonds. You could do it by buying social bonds that can also have an impact in the COVID-19 recovery. You can buy MDB bonds, that would be your multilateral development banks that are issuing bonds. With the proceeds of those bonds, they're going to put them in projects that would fight or mitigate the COVID-19 crisis. Or even if you're a risky person and you want to expose yourself to equities, what we've seen is that probably the best strategy at this point is to follow the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. And here's an example for you. This here is an ETF. It's called the Ishare CI Global Impact ETF. And the ticker for this ETF is SDG, right? And basically what it gives you is exposure to companies whose business model is oriented towards the Sustainable Development Goals. And as you can see in the green highlighted space, the outperformance of this product has been tremendous, right? They have, year to date, they have a net performance of 9.4% versus their peers, or an 8.81% versus their global index. So we're seeing that if you want to have exposure to the markets with this COVID-19 crisis, doing it through an SDG approach is going to be good for you. And it makes sense because, like we said before, this COVID-19 crisis is an E, an S, and a G crisis. So you have to address all 17 Sustainable Development Goals if we want to operate efficiently in the future, if we want our economies to recover, our societies to function properly. All right, so let's go then to what's going to happen next, right? So we've been covering why there's a connection between the COVID-19 and sustainability in general. We also saw that capital markets are reacting positively towards ESG-related companies and ESG-related instruments, right? So now we're going to see what's going to be next. The first thing I want to say is that we don't know, right? And I don't know. But I'm going to give you 3 ideas to help you think about this in the future. So the first change, which is actually an ongoing shift that was prior to this COVID-19 crisis, is the notion of redefining capitalism, right? So you go to any global think tank today is going to talk to you about the business purpose, right? Redefining the purpose, redefining the value, redefining or overcoming that stockholder supremacy that we used to have in the markets for a more stakeholder inclusive approach of governance of companies. So we believe that this COVID-19 crisis is going to put that tension about the stockholder supremacy to rest, because there's no society, there's no market, and if there are no markets, there's no money to be made, right? Now, the second shift, which is very, very tricky, is how this COVID-19 is going to bend the sustainability agenda worldwide. So the sustainability agenda, another way to express this SDGs is that the sustainability agenda is the agenda of systems transformation. So there are 5 economic systems that need to be transformed in the next decades. Those five are cities, right? This is the place where we live. This is the place where we determine what's produced and what's consumed, right? This is a place that have pollution problems, transportation problems, need schools, hospitals, so on and so forth. So we need smarter cities. The second system is climate and energy. So of course we had to meet the demand of energy in a clean and responsible and sustainable way, right? Without harming the planet. The third system has to do with people. That has to do with income inequalities, for instance. So, and this is of the utmost importance, because if we don't tackle inequalities, then populism is going to keep on rising and is going to undermine any effort that we want to put forward in terms of sustainability. We've seen it in many countries where they wanted to levy a carbon tax, and then there was riots in the streets. So if we don't tackle inequality, then it's going to be very hard to make this transformation of the other systems, right? The fourth system has to do with food and nature. We had to be able to feed 10 billion people, right, in a sustainable way. And at the same time, we need some reservoirs to make sure that nature absorbs itself at least 1/3 of our carbon emissions if we want to accomplish a 1.5 degree or 2 degrees Celsius scenario. And last but not least, the fifth system that needs to be trimmed is a circular economy. So we had to increase the circularity of the inputs that we put into our products, those minerals, right? So those elements, those metals, because otherwise there won't be able to meet demand, and in the end, we will kill our planet, right? So these are the five systems. Now the problem is, and I've been inspired by an economic concept, called the production possibilities frontier, which means that imagine that you're a company and you have the right competences to produce two different products. You can produce phones or you can produce computers, laptops, right? So you have to decide what's the right mix. Can I put all my resources to produce phones, or all my resources to produce laptops, or maybe a combination of both? So my function as a company is to maximize the value of my decision, right? So I have to decide what's the right trade-off between phones and laptops, okay? This is an easy problem from an economic standpoint. Now let's talk about sustainability. And imagine that you're a company that you have already committed to fight climate change, to mitigate climate change. You established a budget of capital expenditures, of CapEx, some investments that you're going to do that are going to reduce your carbon footprint in the future, right? So that was your decision, December 31st, 2019. And then, boom, you have the COVID-19 crisis. And of course, you have to face this crisis. So now you have to split your budget. So on the one hand, you have to fight climate change. And on the other hand, you have to make lots of investments in order for you to adapt your business to this COVID-19 era. So this is going to bend the agenda. And this is probably going to affect your investments in climate change adaptation. So the tricky element for sustainability officers right now is going to be, okay, what's the most efficient mix between fighting climate change, for instance, and adapting to a COVID-19 scenario. Here you can see on the left-hand side, for a company, since you have a given budget, this trade-off is a straight line. But if you think about the global economy with all those different resources, it's a curve, right? Because there are more interactions, more permutation possible, right? But nevertheless, we're gonna see these kind of trade-offs. So the big question is, are sustainability projects are gonna be delayed because of the COVID-19? It's a very hard question. But for many people, we're talking about a green recovery, right? So that we should encourage our governments to spend their fiscal stimulus into green projects so that we can actually make it compatible, the fighting climate change, for example, with the COVID-19 crisis. And the last shift, and this would be my last slide, have to do with boards of directors, right? So if we want to produce this miracle, if all these things need to happen, we're gonna need more sustainability competences within boards of directors, which quite honestly, in general and broadly speaking, most companies lack of, right? So we have tremendous competences in finance, for instance, and in governance and in legal and compliance, but we lack of the proper ESG competences in general among boards of directors. So we need to make this change within boards. We need to make a better connections between the board of directors and sustainability officers, because we believe, as you said at the beginning of the presentation with the response to my poll, we believe that demand for ESG, the demand for sustainability is going to increase for companies, particularly from investors, but also from society and from governments. And that would be all from me. And of course, I'm very happy to take whatever questions you might have. So thank you all very much.
Jaime, you already have a question in the comment section.
Okay, where can I find the comments?
Okay. At the bottom of your screen, do you see something that says chat? Maybe it's blinking, I guess.
No. Not really, no.
Okay, do you want me to read it out to you?
Yes, please, if you will, yeah.
Okay, so Ryan is asking, do you worry that business leaders, especially those in small and mid-sized companies, will give in to the pressure to lean towards immediate economic solutions that will include unsustainable practices?
Wow, Ryan. Ryan, it's a great question. Please take this answer with a pinch of salt, right? So SMEs are right now absolutely threatened. I mean, they most of them won't survive this crisis, honestly. I think that at this point, thinking about being more sustainable is a secondary issue. And it should be, in my opinion. Of course, I would love them to be even sustainable, even in these circumstances. But the role that SMEs play in keeping up employment and economic activity is essential. So I think the burden of sustainability is going to go back again on big multinationals, and SMEs are in survival mode. So I think we have to be more lenient or more permissive with them.
Okay. He also followed up, and he also wrote, how can we incentivize the leaders to take opportunity to implement more long-term sustainable practices rather than the short terms that he was referring to?
That's a great question. So I think that is going to happen, and it's going to happen because there are two pressures that are acting together in tandem, not necessarily coordinated, but somehow it's happening. On the one hand, you have regulation. So if you see most OECD countries, regulation towards corporate governance is pushing corporate boards to be more accountable when it comes to sustainability issues, and particularly with respect to ESG risks. So on the one hand, you have the regulation, and on the other hand, you have the invisible hand of the markets. So now the markets are realizing how ESG is creating value. It's a great tool to minimize risks, exposures. We saw 3 or 4 slides confirming that fact indeed. So it could be from from an altruistic desire or from a self-serving desire, but investors are going to push companies to be more long-term oriented and more sustainable. So that combination of regulation along with investors' demands are going to push towards a better governance.
Okay, I think that, oh wait, there's one more. Okay. Anika is asking, how large is the variation of ESG equity premium for different sectors? And he says, I imagine energy has shown more variability than consumer goods, for example.
Well, actually, I wouldn't have the exact response to that question. What I can tell you is there are regional variations. So the place where you find the lowest risk premium or ESG premium is the US. And this is basically the lion's share of the value created in the US is by tech companies and startups, which tend to have a very low ESG profile. And that means that's why you have a lower premium. But if you go to Japan and Europe, it's similar, it's about 12%. And if you go to emerging markets, it's about 35%. Of course, there's going to be variation on these premiums, the same way that there's variation in risk premiums across the board. But if you're interested in the sector analysis, there's a piece of research done by Bank of America Merrill Lynch, something called ESG from A to Z. And then you will find what are the key ESG factors that affect both to return on equity and to volatility of earnings. So you're going to be very surprised because they do it by sector and by region, and you find lots of information about that.
Okay. One more question from Diego. He's saying, regarding the financial sector, how can they play a more active role in terms of ESG and the way the shock is being handled right now?
Well, so I think that the financial sector has been just awoken to this ESG realm. If you see BlackRock, which is the world's largest money manager, has been pushing the ESG agenda within their firm for at least 5 years. Of course, many European counterparts have been doing that for 20 years, but nevertheless, you see the big established asset management firms committing themselves towards ESG. In the case of BlackRock, they said not only that they're going to increase their offer in terms of ESG, what they said is that their whole offer, their whole 7 trillion or whatever it is these days of assets under management, they're going to take into account ESG. Another trend that I think is very interesting is passive investing. As you know, passive investing is growing and growing and growing, and it's creating the need in order to legitimize their market share, their dominance in the market. They need to be more ESG-oriented. And we're seeing an explosion of new products within the ETF space that are integrating ESG, like the one I showed you before, related to SDGs, right? So we are seeing this kind of passive products that are very strong at advocating with management, at the AGMs. So I think this is also happening. So I'm confident that the marketplace is becoming more green or greener and more ESG oriented.
Okay, thank you. I don't think there are any more questions. Not that I can see. Do you want to add any more? Or maybe you want to mention something that maybe nobody asked yet?
Okay. Well, what I would say is I want to thank you all for organizing this webinar. I hope that it was enriching for you guys, that at least you took some ideas. I think we are in the midst of a big change, a big shift. We were before the COVID-19 crisis, but the COVID-19 crisis is going to accelerate this adoption of ESG across the board. So I thank you very much for your attention. I'm happy to be back again anytime you want.
Thank you so much. Thank you everyone for coming as well. Hope to see everyone soon. Take care. Bye-bye.
Take care. Bye-bye.